Good morning, and thank you for joining us for another episode in the museum's Stay Connected Facebook Live series. I'm historian Edna Friedberg. Although the Holocaust Museum remains closed due to the coronavirus pandemic, learning about this history doesn't have to stop. So instead, we are coming to you live from our homes, and we thank you in advance for your patience if we experience any technical problems during the run of the show. If you start having difficulties with the stream, we ask that you please start by trying to refresh your browser, see if that resolves it. If not, rest assured that immediately after the show ends, it will be available in its entirety to watch on demand, so you can come back later, see it when it's convenient, and also share it with your friends. As we bring you today's program, many cities across our country are convulsed in grief and anger. Our museum is outraged at the horrific killing of George Floyd, an African-American man, and we recognize that this is not an isolated incident. Recently, we have watched with great alarm the rise in deadly hatred and unapologetic racism. Years ago, our museum's founder declared that whenever men or women are persecuted because of their race, religion, or political views, that place must, at that moment, become the center of the universe. Elie Wiesel's words remind us that we have a conscience, that we have an obligation, and we have a collective responsibility to fight bigotry in whatever form it emerges. Underpinning the museum's educational and memorial mission is the promotion of human dignity. This week begins Pride Month, an annual commemoration of riots at New York City's Stonewall Inn, which helped catapult the fight for gay rights to national attention more than 50 years ago. Pride Month is not only a celebration of the achievements and contributions of LGBT people, but also acknowledges the pain and violence that this community has endured. Today's program is dedicated to the stories of gay people persecuted by the Nazis. And our guest this morning is an expert on this topic, my colleague, Dr. Jake Newsome. Welcome, Jake.
Good morning, Edna. Great to be here with you in this digital space.
Absolutely, and I'm glad to get a peek inside your house too. During today's show, please send us your questions for Jake in the comments section, and we will answer as many of them as we can in the course of the program. Jake, let's begin by giving people a sense of what life was like for the gay community in Germany, both before and during the Nazi period. What was the capital city, Berlin, like? What was the environment?
Yeah, so before the Nazis came to power, as you mentioned, Berlin was the capital of Germany, but in many ways it was also the capital of the gay capital of the world. Folks came there from all over, from New York, Paris, London, to join in what we would today call the LGBT community. So here you can see an image on your screen of the dance floor of the El Dorado, which was a gay-friendly club there in Berlin around 1929. But amidst this unprecedented level of tolerance, Germany had a law on the books, a national law called Paragraph 175 against gay acts. The wording was against so-called unnatural indecency among men. But the police in Berlin had begun relaxing their enforcement of this law, which helped allow this LGBT community to flourish. But that wasn't always the case, especially in the rural parts of Germany. Now, when the Nazis came to power in 1933, there was a really quick and brutal crackdown on the gay community. So, for example, they began shutting down all of the gay clubs, all the bars and the meeting places. And this stemmed from the fact that the Nazis believed that homosexuality was a choice. It was a temptation that anyone could give into. So the idea was, if you remove it from the public sphere, you remove that temptation. And according to the Nazis, the threat of homosexuality was the idea that gay Germans gave up their duty to essentially make babies for the fatherland. And so this was a threat to the literal reproduction of the so-called master race. And so as we'll see over the episode today, during the 12-year period of the Third Reich, over 100,000 men were arrested under the law, sent to prison, concentration camps, and were even subjected to really horrible medical experiments that were aimed at curing them.
I'm struck when we saw that photograph of the El Dorado, I think from a sort of pop culture perspective, it may remind many people of having seen the play or movie Cabaret and the way that that tolerant and diverse context and cultural milieu was attacked and under assault and shattered by the Nazis. I'd like to give a shout out to people who are watching us. Thank you for joining us this morning from El Salvador, Guatemala, India, Brazil, Germany, Ukraine, and all around the United States, including Neptune Beach, Florida, Phoenix, Arizona, Hanover, Pennsylvania, Nashville, Tennessee, Wilmington, Delaware, Baldwin, Missouri, and Atlanta, Georgia. Good morning to all of you. We're really glad that you're here. Jake, you've described for us the Nazi condemnation of gay men. Did their policies also target lesbians and what we would now call trans people?
So the law that we've referred to pertained only to men. And the Nazis made the decision not to target lesbians for two main reasons. The first was that women did not occupy leadership roles in the economy, in the military, or in national politics. So any perceived threat by lesbians would not be as a direct threat to the state in the same way that gay men would be. And so the Nazis believed they should save their law enforcement, efforts for something a more direct threat. But the second reason, a little more nefarious, is that the Nazis believed that lesbians could still be impregnated, right, even with force if necessary, to be able to again produce the next generation of the so-called master race. And so this idea that they could still be used as a tool for reproduction kept them out of that law. But just because that lesbians weren't targeted by this particular law, of course, that didn't mean that they escaped persecution. They were forced back into a life of secrecy, back into the closet, if you will, and they were expected to conform to Nazi expectations of womanhood and motherhood. But some lesbians actually were arrested for usually for another reason. Here you see on your screen an image of a woman named Hemi Sherman, and she was, as we'll see, targeted for more than one reason. But on the back of her prisoner card, it noted that Hemi Sherman was a licentious lesbian. She was known to be an unmarried shop girl in Frankfurt, but the note said that everyone knew that she went to lesbian bars. But then it also notes that she was, quote, a stateless Jew, and mentions that she refused to go by the name Sarah, which this was a policy by the Nazis in the mid-1930s, which forced all Jewish women to go by the middle name Sarah, which would have made them easier to identify. Unfortunately, Hemi Sherman was murdered in the gas chambers in the killing centers of Nuremberg. But again, we can look at this and think that probably her so-called crime of being Jewish was the reason for her death.
And Jake, what about trans people?
Yes. So you mentioned, unfortunately, we know very little about folks we would call today trans, their fate during the Holocaust. And part of that stems from the fact that the Nazis didn't differentiate between, gay people, bi people, or trans people. Essentially, they used an umbrella term, homosexual. And so for historians looking back, it's hard to try to figure out in the records, maybe who was gay, who was actually trans. So this is difficult, but it's not impossible. And thankfully, we do have scholars, at least one scholar that I know of who is actually working in our archives to write this history. So I'm hoping that in the next year or so, we will be able to not only know, but tell and share the stories of trans people during the Holocaust.
And it's also, it's all so important because a second way that people are victimized is by being forgotten. If nobody knows about the crimes committed against you, it's as though they didn't happen in some ways. So let's, on that note, turn to another individual to put a face to these policies and the human impact of them. Tell us about an artist named Richard Grune, who moved to Berlin shortly after the Nazi rise to power. Not really great timing.
Yeah. So Richard Grune, as you mentioned, was an artist. He grew up in a small German town. You can see his picture there on the screen. He was 25 years old when he decided to move to Berlin because, of course, he wanted to study art, but he wanted to take part in this gay culture that we talked about that Berlin was so famous for. But unfortunately, he moved to Berlin in February of 1933. So we're talking just literally a matter of weeks after Hitler was appointed chancellor. So a little after a year of moving to Berlin, Richard was arrested in December of 1934 under suspicions of being gay. And during police interrogation, he admitted that he was gay, and he was sentenced to and then spent the next 10 years of his life, a full decade, in prison, but then also in concentration camps. He went from Sachsenhausen and later transferred to Flossenburg.
So 10 years of his life incarcerated simply for being a gay man. That was his crime, was being who he was.
That was his crime, yes.
How would authorities even know? How did they discover, for example, that Richard was gay? How would they know what people did in their private lives or in their homes?
Right, so we mentioned earlier that the Nazis had tried to, they shut down gay bars in public. And so since there weren't any public spaces left, the gay community began gathering in their homes. And so in 1934, Richard hosted a Christmas party. And from the records that we have, that it was a very lively and festive occasion. But unfortunately, it did gather unwanted attention from one of his neighbors there in the apartment building in which he lived. And she saw, gay couples and lesbian couples going into Richard's apartment. And so she felt empowered to turn Richard in to the local authorities. And there's a reason for, that she felt so empowered. It's because the Nazis from the beginning, really turned on their propaganda machine and began publicly, describing gay men as antisocial parasites and enemies of the state. So really fermenting this atmosphere that was conducive for people to denounce these men to the authorities. We know that was successful because ultimately 1/3 of all cases against gay men resulted from civilian denunciations. And so, for example, Richard was a victim of denunciation that night, but it also included 70 other people who attended the party or were in his circle of friends.
And this kind of atmosphere of suspicion, of looking at your neighbor, your loved one with an eye towards how are they dangerous, how are they deviant. This was a very, very big part of Nazi society. I know we have cases that historians have found of gay men being turned in by their own siblings or other family members. And not only gay men, but an overall Nazi approach of trying to tear apart the social fabric, turn people against one another. We have many cases of young people, of teenagers denouncing their own parents for anti-Nazi activities. So I think it's hard to overstate how terrifying that atmosphere of suspicion and unease must have been to live in day after day, year after year. I'd like to again remind our viewers that Jake would be glad to answer your questions. Please post them in the comment section and we will answer as many as we can. So Jake, after Richard Grune spent 10 years of his life either in jail or doing hard slave labor in concentration camps, what happened to him after the war?
So at the very end of the war, the Nazis seek to evacuate the Flossenburg camp as a way to try to hide the evidence of what they've done. And in that confusion, Richard is able to escape, and he actually runs home and then hides and lives with his sister. But a couple of years after the end of the war, he publishes a series of lithographs in which he depicts the life, inside the concentration camps. And so you can see one of those images here on your screen, produced by Richard. And the entire series really just depicts very nightmarish scenes, which I guess in a lot of ways, each day in the camps was a living nightmare for Richard. But this series of lithographs is considered among some of the most important visual records that were created in the post-war period that depict life in the camps and help us understand particularly the fate of this the gay community that's been underrepresented up to this point.
And it looked like in that image we were seeing prisoners crammed into overcrowded barracks.
Yes.
In a concentration camp. Jake, how did persecution of gay men differ from Nazi treatment of Jews?
Yeah, so there, of course, when we're dealing with the Holocaust, there are no simple answers, but in a way to try to put this as simple as possible, the Nazis believed that being gay was a choice, whereas being Jewish was not, right? The policies towards these gay Germans remained, at least officially, that they would re-educate or cure these gay men of their so-called vice, and then reintegrate them back into society as productive members of society. So this was not an option, of course, for folks like Jews or even the Roma, who the Nazis believed that their crime, their so-called crime, was deeper than that. So, for example, the Nazis didn't believe that being Jewish was just cultural or religious, that it was deeper and biological, and it was tied to their race. So Jews couldn't decide just not to be Jewish, and this is what led to, right, ultimately the system of mass murder and genocide. On the other hand, gay men, because of this idea that they could somehow be redeemed, were not sent as a group to the gas chambers.
Jake, we have a viewer question. A man named David is asking, are there any memorial museums devoted exclusively to the persecution of homosexuals?
Of course, there are museums in many parts of the world. We have them here in America, in San Francisco and New York, but also in Berlin, that are dedicated to gay gay history and gay culture. But there are a number of memorials and monuments also in several countries that are dedicated specifically to the gay victims of the Nazi regime.
Jake, can you tell us how over time the Nazis tightened the laws that they used to prosecute gay men?
Yeah, so one of the things to remember is that this law, the anti-gay law, existed in Germany before the Nazis. In fact, when Germany was founded as a country in 1871, this law was among the original in the German criminal code. But that original version required certain types of proof in order to grant a conviction. And the Nazis thought that this was too restrictive. So in 1935, which is the same year, the same month even, that they are writing what we now call the infamous Nuremberg race laws, which stripped Jews of their citizenship. They also decide to amend and rewrite the anti-gay law. And the new version is left specifically vague, which allowed law enforcement and judges to really interpret it however they wanted to, in a very tactical effort to arrest as many gay men as possible. And so actually we get to the point in the early 1940s where some Nazi judges even say that the intent or the contemplation to commit a gay act was enough for a conviction. And so at this point, we really see that there's just no requirement for proof whatsoever, because you're essentially saying that even gay thoughts are enough for a conviction.
Jake, you mentioned judges. I want to make sure that viewers understand that these are not rogue judges or rogue police officers. They are carrying out state policy to target a specific group. It's not their interpretation, it's the law and everything that the law allows. Mm-hmm. Within that, what was the effect of broadening this law, and what were the penalties for men convicted under it?
So as you might imagine, the number of arrests and convictions after this 1935 change skyrockets. And in fact, it increases by 750%. So we go from numbers, the pre-Nazi period where they're convicting on an average 290 men per year, to under the Nazi period, over 3,500 men per year. And so the penalties include always a steep fine, but in addition to at least anywhere from 1 to 10 years in prison. And in prison always included hard labor as a way, the Nazis felt like if we just put these men in hard labor, it will somehow make them more manly and reorient them to the so-called normal way of life.
We know that gay men were sent to concentration camps. You've told us about Richard Grune and others. Was that actually an explicit part of the law?
No. So time in concentration camps was not explicitly stated in the law, but the SS felt that sometimes a quote unquote, a normal prison sentence wasn't strong enough to combat this threat of homosexuality. So out of those 100,000 men that were arrested, We know that up to 15,000 were sent to concentration camps because they were so-called repeat offenders.
And I'd like to acknowledge we are looking here at mugshots of men arrested under this anti-gay law. Let's pay tribute to them by saying their names out loud. August Anton Will, Heinrich Arntzen, Georg Kleider, Emil Neumann, and Robert Reuter. These are among the 100,000 arrestees who Jake has just mentioned. Jake, we've had a couple of questions from viewers, one from a viewer named Nora asking about whether gay prisoners, gay men were required to wear a triangle. Was it purple? Was it pink? Could you explain that, please?
Absolutely. So inmates sent to the concentration camps had to wear a badge that denoted their so-called crime. And there were different colored badges for different crimes. And gay men, those arrested for the law were required to wear a pink triangle on their uniform.
And that badge denoted their crime, but also established a kind of de facto hierarchy within camps for brutality, for violence, a pecking order by both prisoners and guards, right?
Yep, that's a great point. The homophobia of the society didn't stop at the barbed wire, right? So these men with the pink triangle had to face discrimination not only from the guards, but from their fellow inmates as well, right? And we know that those the pink triangle prisoners often, had really incredibly hard work details. Sometimes they were given less food. Again, with this idea that a harsh environment would somehow cure them of, or at least force them to give up their lifestyle. And we also know of a series of really horrible and invasive and humiliating medical experiments done on gay prisoners. Because the Nazis beginning to think that maybe there is a biological reason for being gay, maybe people are born that way, and so they began looking for a biological cure for this so-called disease. And another fact that really stands out as particularly horrifying is that a lot of these gay concentration camp prisoners were told that they could be released and go back to their family and their lives, but only if they submitted to so-called voluntary castration.
Really hard to think of anything crueler as a choice to offer to someone. Let's hear about another young man who was ensnared in the Nazi assault on gay men, a man named Josef Kohut. Tell us about his experience.
So Josef, he lived in Vienna, Austria, which Austria had been annexed by the Nazi Germany in 1938. Here you can see a picture of Josef on your screen. But he was 24 and in love for the first time. And he sent a Christmas card to his boyfriend, Fred. And unfortunately, that Christmas card was intercepted. And fortunately, at least for Fred, I guess, the boyfriend, his father was a Nazi official, so he was shielded from prosecution. But Josef was arrested in 1939 and sent to Sachsenhausen concentration camp, where he was forced to labor in a brick factory. But later, like Richard, actually, he was transferred to Flossenburg concentration camp. And he later wrote that there was one memory that continuously stood out and haunted him. And that was on Christmas Eve in 1941. The prisoners were called to the central grounds there at the Flossenburg camp, where there was a Christmas tree set up. But next to the Christmas tree were 8 Russian prisoners who were all hanging from the gallows. And Josef later wrote that after, even though he had survived, he could never hear a Christmas carol, no matter how beautifully sung after that, without thinking about the Flossenburg Christmas tree with its grisly decorations.
Sorry, it's just such a disturbing story. It's hard to kind of just segue to another question right after that. But the state-sponsored targeting of gay men in Germany didn't end in 1945. How long did these Nazi-era laws remain on the books?
So after the end of the war, many Nazi laws were removed through a process of denazification. But one law that escaped this denazification was the Nazi anti-gay law, right? And both East and West Germany integrated this law into their new criminal codes. East Germany did ultimately revert back to the original wording, but West Germany kept and used the Nazi version of the anti-gay law. And between 1949 and 1969, they arrested 100,000 West German gay men with the Nazi version of the law. Now, this law was ultimately, it was amended in 1969, but not fully repealed until 1994.
And I think it's important to note that we're not just singling out Germany here, but that this type of anti-gay law or laws criminalizing gay acts were on the books across most, if not all, European countries, and also here in the United States, many states for decades and decades after the war. Jake, we're getting a lot of viewer questions, so I want to ask you a couple of them.
Sure.
Viewers named Patrice and Abraham would like to know if you could speak a bit about Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld.
Oh, yeah, so Magnus Hirschfeld was really a pioneer of his time who lived in the pre-Nazi period, and he was one of the first to lead the efforts to study the science of human sexuality. And so he, through his research, argued that people, just like people were born straight, people were also born gay. And so therefore it was immoral and wrong for the government to prosecute and persecute people for something that they were born with and that they couldn't change. So in a lot of ways, Hirschfeld was one of the first gay rights activists because he led a concerted effort against the law and tried to have that law repealed. He studied, as I said, he studied it and tried to base everything in science. But unfortunately, because of his prominence as he was Jewish and socialist and advocating for gay rights, he became a very early target of the Nazi regime. And unfortunately, he died in exile during the early years of the Nazi regime.
We have a question from a viewer named Todd that kind of dovetails with a question that I had for you. Todd is asking if you can talk about how the gay liberation movement came to adopt the pink triangle as a symbol. And the question that I'd like to piggyback that onto is, what were the real life implications of these 100,000 post-war arrests you talked about? What did they do to people's lives?
So I'll answer the second part of that question first, because it leads really nicely into the gay rights movement. But the implications of this law after the war was, of course, there were no more concentration camps, but there were still, if you were arrested under this law, you could still be fined, you could still be sent to prison. Your name was added to a pink list, which was the name of known or even suspected gay men, which could, they could take your driver's license, they could, your employers could fire you, you could be denied housing. So it helped create and continue this atmosphere of fear and oppression for the gay community. And so that in part leads to the rise of the gay rights movement, particularly in Germany, where the gay rights activists, they want to have a symbol that would help unite the gay community to push for legal equality in the present. And they looked for a number of different logos, but in 1942, Joseph Kohut, that we talked about earlier, publishes a book that it's the very first autobiography of a gay concentration camp survivor, and he titles it quite simply, "The Men with the Pink Triangle." And so the members of the gay rights movement, they see this book, they see how powerful the symbol of the pink triangle can be, and they reclaim the symbol, which was once a symbol of damnation, into a symbol now of empowerment and community to continue fighting for rights in the present.
And not only empowerment and community, but also awareness that the suffering of gay men during the Nazi regime should not be forgotten and should be acknowledged. So it's a kind of in-your-face way of saying, see us.
Absolutely.
In addition to Kohut's book, a viewer named Deb would like to know, Jake, if you can recommend any books on the Nazi persecution of gays.
Absolutely. So right now there are a series, there's 3 autobiographies if you wanted to read memoirs. So there is one called, written by a French gay man who was arrested and spent time in a camp. His name is Pierre Ciel. And then there was also one by actually a gay Jewish man by the name of Gad Beck. And I believe in English that one is called An Underground Life. But then there are a number of historical accounts that would be a great read. One that I can think of off the top of my head is called Sex in the Weimar Republic by Laurie Moorhofer, which talks talks about this transition from the Weimar period to the Nazi period in really great detail.
And we'll be glad to post in the comment section later titles. We have a bibliography that our library puts out about this topic, as well as links to other places that you can explore online. I know one of the earliest digital exhibitions that I worked on when I came to the museum was actually one about Godbeck and his boyfriend at the time.
Yes.
A viewer named Allison actually is asking whether the museum will be doing a special exhibit on this topic. And in fact, Allison, we did conduct a major research project and had a major special exhibition called Nazi Persecution of Homosexuals, which then toured the country in a traveling form. And there is an online version of that. So we will be sure to post links to that later. We have many, many more questions. I am sorry that we are really out of time, but Jake and I will both go in after the show and try to answer some of those. So please, come back later and see. Don't think just because we didn't get to your question now that it is not important to us. It certainly is. So Jake, thank you very much for teaching us today, for sharing your knowledge of this lesser known, but no less important chapter in the history of the Nazi era. Thank you.
Thanks for having me on, and thanks to everyone for the questions.
I want to thank you, our viewers, for joining us for our Pride Month show. We pay tribute to Richard Grune and Josef Kohut, whose art and writings about their painful personal experiences, which they created and which they shared at a time when there was still so much stigma attached, give recognition for what they had endured. Through their stories, we are able to highlight a lesser known, but no less human and tragic victim group of the Nazi regime. We also ask you to please join us next week for our next episode in the Stay Connected series, when we will be talking about an often invoked quote from German pastor Martin Niemöller, reflecting on our self-interest and the balance between that and communal courage. In recent days, as there's been unrest around the country and around the world, we have seen increased interest in this quote on museum channels, and we would like to offer some context for the man and his famous words who have inspired so many people to join together and stand up for one another. So please come back next week for that conversation. And until then, we hope that you take care and you stay well and safe. Bye-bye.